The first temptation, the one I struggle with most as far as I can tell, is the temptation to focus on my career and my status above my focus on the company's results. That makes me complacent and unfocused, and causes results to slip. And even if I were able to overcome temptation number 1, I might still get unspectacular results if I gave in to temptation number 2, the need to be liked and popular with your staff, at the expense of holding them accountable. That's your problem, right? He motioned toward the stylish man, who nodded. Andrew continued. And even when we're not overly concerned about being liked by our people, we fail to hold people accountable because we don't feel like it's fair to hold them accountable. And that has something to do with temptation number 3, which I can't quite remember. The bald man helped him out. Decisions. Right. Clarity. We don't feel like it's fair because we don't like to decide things without perfect information. We let things hang there ambiguously without making clear and timely decisions because we don't want to be wrong. So we wait, and in the meantime, someone has to take the blame for things being... The stylish man finished the sentence. Unspectacular. Andrew smiled. Right. And so someone might get embarrassed or demoted or fired, even though no one had the guts to tell them what was expected of them. But even when they do have the guts to make things clear, sometimes they fail to make good decisions and achieve buy-in around their clarity because of temptation number 4, the desire for harmony. They're afraid to entertain conflict, to put their ideas on the line where they might get challenged, so they don't benefit from the various opinions and ideas of their people. And I suppose that is the root cause of all the confusion, the fear of what did you call it? Productive ideological conflict. Charlie smiled and nodded his approval. Yes, but that is not the root of all this. The root is the 5th temptation. Just as he finished the sentence, the train began to slow. At once, Charlie, the bald man, the stylish man, and the tall man looked at their watches, stood, and began to collect their belongings. That's when it dawned on Andrew. They're not going to tell me temptation number 5. As the train came to a halt, the 4 men moved toward the door. You guys aren't serious. You're not going to just stop right there. Only Charlie answered. It's time for us to go, Andy. Andrew moved to block the door. First the tall man, then the bald man, and finally the stylish man stepped around Andrew carefully, nodding their heads or tipping their hats to him as they left. As Charlie approached, Andrew held out his hand. You can't just leave me hanging. Charlie took a breath. Come with me. Charlie exited the train as Andrew turned toward the seat where his briefcase was. At that moment he heard the hydraulic sound of the doors preparing to close. Andrew knew that he wouldn't be able to get off the train if he went back for his case. He ran to the door and leapt from the train just as the doors closed. Watching the train carry his briefcase into the next tunnel, Andrew rubbed his eyes and smiled at the crazy night he was having. He turned around and faced an empty terminal. Everyone was gone, including Charlie. Desperate again, Andrew ran up the escalator to the street exit. Once outside, he looked up and down the street and saw no sign of Charlie. Then he heard a voice behind him. Over here. Andrew jerked around and saw Charlie sitting on a bus stop bench behind him. Charlie looked concerned. What's the matter, Andy? Why are you so desperate? Andrew sighed, walked over to the bench, and sat down next to Charlie. After a few moments, he dropped his head into his hands and spoke. For the first time in my career, I think I'm drowning. And I feel like I'm pulling people down with me just to keep my head above water. I've always been able to turn things up a notch when I needed to, but this doesn't seem to be about turning it up at all. I don't know what it's about. It's like an impossible balancing act with everything constantly moving. So many subtleties, so many details. All the stuff, too much stuff. Charlie patted Andrew on the back. Let me tell you about temptation number 5, Andy. Andrew sat up and took a deep breath. Okay, fire away. My father wasn't the kind of man to brag, but he did brag about one thing: the people who worked for him. He'd get unusually emotional when he talked about the people on his staff. And I remember that he always said he trusted his people with his career. Can you say that, Andy? Andrew shook his head without hesitating. Not even close. Some of those people probably wouldn't care one way or the other if I stepped down tomorrow. Why do you suppose that is? Andrew stared off across the empty street. Gradually, he began to shake his head. I don't know. They're all so focused on their own careers. And you? I don't know, Charlie. I guess I'm as concerned about my career as the next guy, but I don't think I'm any worse. I'm not asking you that. I was wondering if they could trust you with their careers. Andrew stared out across the empty street again. Charlie, I don't want to sound like I don't care, but I don't think it's my job to hold these people's careers in my hand. That's not the point, Andy. All of this is about trust. It's about risking and building trust. And before they trust you, you have to trust them. You have to be vulnerable. Wait a second, Charlie, what does that have to do with conflict? Well, why do you suppose people are afraid of conflict? I guess they're not used to it, or they get their feelings hurt easily. Maybe. But I think it has a lot to do with trust. People who trust one another aren't worried about holding back their opinions or their passions. They say what they think and know that they aren't going to be vulnerable if they do. Andrew looked doubtful. I don't know, Charlie. I think a little tension between people is good. If you trust one another too much, you get soft. You lose your edge. I don't want my people feeling too comfortable. People slack off when they're too comfortable. Come on, Andy. There's a difference between being complacent and being trustworthy. You're smarter than that. Maybe. I'm just not a very trusting person, Charlie. Do you know why people don't trust other people? Because they're afraid of getting burned. That's what I mean by vulnerability. And you know what the best cure for that is? Opening yourself up to being burned. Sometimes it's even okay to get burned because you realize it's not fatal. Andrew sighed. So you're telling me that I don't like conflict because I don't trust people, and I don't trust people because I'm afraid of being vulnerable. Yes, you're afraid of being vulnerable, being wrong, being unpopular, losing your status. And you're telling me that great CEOs like your father go around leaving themselves open to people stabbing them in the back? As crazy as it sounds, they do. My father never worried about being vulnerable with his people. He trusted them. That's what allowed them to feel comfortable having healthy, productive conflict. No one worried about getting hurt. Andrew took a deep breath. So the root of all this is vulnerability? Charlie nodded and checked his watch. Andrew sighed. This is getting too touchy-feely for me. Touchy-feely? Getting results, holding people accountable, creating clarity for your people, engaging in productive conflict with them. If all those depend ultimately on vulnerability and trust, isn't it worth tolerating just a hint of touchy-feeliness if that's what you think it is? Andrew shrugged. I don't know. At that moment, a bus pulled up. Charlie stood. That's my ride. Andrew asked his final question. So how do I get comfortable being vulnerable? The bus door opened. Charlie patted Andrew on the shoulder and stepped on board. You'll have to figure that one out for yourself, Andy. Give it a try. The old man smiled as the door closed. As the bus pulled away, Andrew stepped off the curb into the street and watched it disappear. The sound of a horn startled Andrew. He turned and saw bright lights, an oncoming bus. Andrew screamed. Again the horn sounded. Again Andrew screamed, waking himself as the train pulled into the Walnut Creek station. Wiping the sleep from his eyes, Andrew checked his watch. Just 20 minutes had passed since he boarded the train. It always amazed Andrew how much dreaming a person could do in a short period of time. Grabbing his briefcase, which he was glad to know was still there, Andrew exited the train and moved toward the exit of the BART station. The next day's board meeting wasn't weighing on him quite as heavily as it had been a half hour earlier. Andrew O'Brien had never been late to a board meeting in his life, but today, at 9:02 a.m., he sat at his desk and stared out the picture window toward the Bay Bridge. Any confidence he felt last night on his way home from the BART station had disappeared. The men in his strange dream, Charlie, the bald man, the tall man, the stylish man, those men could not have seemed less relevant now. Andrew was dreading the next few hours of his life, but he took a deep breath and headed for the door. Because it was the annual meeting, the boardroom was crowded. The chairman, a large man with tan skin, sat at the head of the table. 12 others filled in the rest of the long table. Most were board members, with the exception of Stephen, the CFO, Janice, the head of sales, and Andrew's executive assistant, Joan. Taking the lone vacant chair at the opposite end of the table from the chairman, Andrew nodded his hellos to the board members. Then he noticed a face he had never seen, a woman with sharp features and streaks of gray hair. Before he could acknowledge her, the chairman introduced her.
Andrew, this is Catherine Peterson from B&L Securities. I think you've spoken a few times during the conference calls last quarter. She's taking Carl's spot on the board.
Andrew remembered talking to Catherine, but had forgotten that she would be at the meeting today. He crossed part of the room to shake hands. "It's nice to meet you, Catherine." She didn't say anything, only smiled politely. As Andrew returned to his chair, the chairman began.
All right. I think we're all familiar with the financial results for the quarter.
I'd say they are, Andrew interrupted, unspectacular at best. The room laughed louder than it needed to, the chairman loudest of all.
Right. Anyway, you all received a copy of the quarterly and annual financials in your packets, so you're aware of the details. Rather than make Andrew here drag us through the blood and guts, I thought we could focus on some of the initiatives that are underway for the first part of this year.
Andrew wondered if he was going to get off so easy, hoping desperately that he would. Catherine wrote something on a pad of paper, and he wondered what it was. Andrew presented a summary of customer research, explaining that more work would be needed to confirm that print advertising in business magazines was the answer to their marketing woes. There were polite questions from some members of the board, but not from Catherine, who again made a few notes in her pad, but otherwise seemed uninterested in the conversation. Lunch was brought in at noon, during which Janice, the head of sales, explained the plans for reorganizing the telesales organization. The board members applauded gently at the end of her talk. The board approved a stock repricing initiative and reviewed a shareholder lawsuit. Andrew handled himself masterfully during these conversations, projecting a sense of confidence and humor. He even surprised himself when he found that he was enjoying the meeting. By 2 o'clock, the meeting was losing steam and drawing to a close. The chairman looked at his watch.
Well, I think we've covered everything on our agenda. If there is nothing else, let's call it a day.
Andrew felt a bizarre sense of relief. Bizarre because it was mixed with a hint of guilt. Nonetheless, he couldn't wait to get out of the room, out of the office, and home. Then Catherine raised her hand, trying to get the chairman's attention. He smiled at her, amused at her overly polite way of getting the floor.
Yes, Catherine.
I have a few questions before we go. I don't like to do too much talking at my first board meeting. I usually need a few meetings before I see any patterns that I feel comfortable addressing. But not this time. The room was completely silent. Catherine turned toward Andrew. What do you expect the first couple quarters of the year to look like, Andrew? I know what your projections are, but why do you think the problems you had last year are going to get any better? Andrew paused, but only for a moment. Well, first of all, I expect to hire a head of marketing soon, and having that job filled will be a big boost. Catherine continued to wait, so Andrew went on. And the market should get better this year, and that's going to help us. And finally, we're looking at an acquisition candidate to expand our line of services. Those things will definitely help. Setting her pen down, Catherine looked toward the chairman, who didn't react to Andrew's response. Okay. I sit on a lot of boards, and you pay me real money to be here, so I'm not going to mince my words. The room froze. You're in real trouble here. The chairman spoke.
Certainly, the market is not where it should be, and we'd like to see a stronger revenue, but I don't think Andrew's numbers are.
Catherine interrupted the chairman politely, but sternly. I'm not talking about the numbers. I just don't see a sense of urgency. Waiting for the market to turn around is pretty passive, and thinking that hiring a new marketing head is all you need is a poor turnaround plan. He's not going to have an impact for at least a few quarters. And the acquisition thing, you're having a hard time managing this company. I don't think that buying another company is going to do anything but distract you further. Catherine's bluntness paralyzed the room. Stephen, the CFO, made the first move. I don't want to sound defensive here, but are you completely familiar with our industry? We're doing much better than most of our competitors. Catherine responded. Yes, I know. I did a little research yesterday, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're the number 3 player in an industry of 6 real competitors. 3 of them did much worse than you did, but the other 2 actually did pretty well. I'd say that puts you in trouble. And if I remember correctly, your revenue actually declined since a year ago. The market grew by 5%, which is not much, I admit, but certainly you should be getting your fair share of that growth. The chairman tried to avoid any bloodshed.
You're probably right, Catherine. We need to have a greater sense of urgency around some of these issues, but I think most of our problems lie in marketing, and Terry really did set us back a few quarters.
Again, Catherine turned to Andrew. What was the problem with Terry, anyway? The directness of the question caused Andrew to shift in his chair. Well, he wasn't able to move quickly enough in terms of revamping our advertising. It wasn't just his creative skills. He wasn't a very good manager either. Did you hire him? Andrew nodded. Then his failure is your responsibility. Did you look into his management skills when you hired him? Well, sure, as much as you do with anyone. You figure he can manage if he's an executive. He came highly recommended. What are you looking for in his replacement? How are you going to make sure you don't make the same mistake? Andrew couldn't really answer the question. Luckily, a pounding sound broke the tension. It seemed that someone outside the boardroom was pounding a nail into the wall. Joan, Andrew's assistant, rose and went outside to see what was happening. The chairman jumped in.
Okay, Catherine, I think you've made a few good points, but this is a little too...
Stephen finished the sentence. A little too unfair. It's easy for you to take shots at us like that when things aren't going too well, but it's not as simple as you make it sound. How are we supposed to know if a guy is going to tank like Terry did? The pounding outside stopped, and the room went silent again. Catherine spoke with a hint of sarcasm. Well, maybe you're doing better than I thought. She seemed willing to let the conversation go with that remark. Silence. The chairman spoke.
Okay. Good discussion. Let's call it...
Andrew stood up and faced Catherine. No. We're not doing better than you thought. We've made too many mistakes. Terry was given no management support. We all saw him struggling, and we just let it go on. I let it go on. All eyes were fixed upon Andrew. During the next 10 minutes, Andrew delivered the speech of his life. He talked about results. He talked about accountability. He talked about clarity and conflict. He congratulated Catherine on being willing to put the tough issues on the table. Andrew finished up by saying, if we continue the way we're going now, if our results continue to slide, then I probably shouldn't be in this job. It's time that all of us became more accountable for the way things are around here, and it's going to start with me." He hoped he wouldn't come to regret that remark. Just as he finished, the pounding sound could be heard out in the hallway again. The chairman closed the meeting. "All right. Thank you all for your energy and input. We'll see you in about 12 weeks. The board members gathered their things and headed for the door, with Andrew a few steps behind. Outside in the hallway, the sound of the pounding could be heard again. Andrew saw a maintenance guy hanging a series of pictures along the hallway wall. Andrew asked Joan, "What's this all about?" "We found some old pictures of past CEOs and thought they'd look nice here by the boardroom." Andrew nodded his approval as the second group of board members entered the elevator. He decided to go take a look at the photos. As the elevator doors opened, the chairman stepped inside. "Are you coming, Andrew?" Distracted, Andrew shook his head. "I'll see you downstairs." Everyone but Andrew got into the elevator and the doors closed. Approaching the first photo, Andrew saw that it was a photograph of him taken several years earlier. He didn't have as much gray hair then. Beneath the photo was Andrew's name and an empty space for dates. The next 3 photos were Andrew's most recent predecessors who ran the company for a total of 25 years. The fourth photo in the row showed a handsome man who looked familiar to Andrew, but he couldn't place where he'd seen the man. The name below was not familiar at all. The pounding stopped, and the maintenance man, his back turned to Andrew, put his hammer in his belt. His job seemed complete. Andrew moved on to the next photo. This face was also familiar, but this time Andrew recognized him immediately. The bald man. Andrew went back to the previous photo and now recognized the stylish man. He suspected that the photo following the bald man's would be, yes, it was, the tall man. The last photo in the row showed a kind-looking man with white hair and a wrinkled smile. It could be no one but Charlie. Charles Pierce, actually. Suddenly, it dawned on Andrew that the maintenance man was wearing the same color shirt that Charlie had worn in his dream. Turning toward the end of the hallway, Andrew saw the old man turn the corner. He called, "Sir? Charlie?" The old man did not answer or reappear. Andrew sprinted to the end of the hall, turned the corner, and saw no one. 3 years later. Again, the boardroom was crowded. The chairman began.
"Well, it has been a terrific year, especially considering the results of the prior 2 or 3 years. The company is healthier than it's been in a long time. Our marketing is more assertive. Our turnover is down, and our revenue is growing again. The stock price is high enough that we can even consider a mid-year split."
Golf applause from the board members. Then Catherine spoke up. "I think the executive team deserves a lot of credit. The decisiveness and discipline of leadership here has been amazing." Catherine and the rest of the board turned toward their CEO, who could barely keep from smiling. He spoke to the group. "Thank you. I appreciate your kind words, but I don't deserve the credit. Certainly my team has been terrific, and the guidance of the board has been helpful. And ironically, I received some pretty good advice from an unlikely person, Andrew O'Brien."
"Andrew? How is he? I haven't talked to him since we let him go."
"You know, he seemed fine, but we really didn't talk about him." Catherine asked, "Where did you see him?" The CEO smiled. "That's the funny thing. I ran into him one night on a BART train."
When people finish this fable, one of the most common questions they ask me is, "So what exactly happened to Andrew anyway?" Of course, I can't give them a satisfying answer, so I usually ask them what they think happened. Understandably, most of them tell me that they assume Andrew just failed. And interestingly enough, many of them assume that Charlie was a very successful CEO. But Andrew's success or failure is really impossible to determine because we don't know what happened during the 3 years after the board meeting at the end of the story. And for that matter, Charlie's success or failure as a CEO is unclear because, as wise as Charlie was in the story, we don't actually know what kind of results the company achieved during his tenure. But the key point here is that all leaders struggle because, like Andrew, they're all susceptible to one or more of the 5 temptations. But having those temptations is not why they ultimately fail. Leaders fail because they're unwilling to put their temptations on the table for others to see. Because it's only through this kind of openness that they can enlist the support of subordinates and peers who are in a unique position to help. The trouble with this is that it calls for a seemingly excessive level of scrutiny around the leader's behavior, which many leaders resent and resist. You see, they can't figure out why people in their organization constantly monitor their behavior so closely when there are so many other problems in the company that need fixing. Of course, they're missing the point entirely. What leaders perceive as criticism is actually invaluable counsel. Here's another way to look at this. When I work with executive teams, I explain that if a CEO's behavior is 95% sound, while the rest of the organization is just 50% sound, I'll still choose to focus initially on that crucial and leveraged 5% that makes up the remainder of the CEO's behavior. Now, while every leader agrees with this line of thinking in theory, few are willing to put it into practice and endure the painful self-examination that's required to fix that final 5%. And yet, a willingness to do this is exactly what separates leaders who succeed from those who fail. But if this is so, then why don't all leaders step up and endure the pain? Well, that's because too many of them mistakenly believe they can avoid it and still find a way to succeed. So they search for silver bullets in marketing or technology, hoping that somehow they will find a way to solve their problems without having to look at themselves. What they're really doing is trading short-term pain, which is the struggle, for longer-term pain, which is the likelihood of failure. The key to success, then, is not to avoid the susceptibility to the 5 temptations. While that would be desirable, it's not possible. The key is to embrace the process of self-examination that reveals the temptations and then to keep those temptations in the open where they can be addressed. Of course, this can't be accomplished overnight, and unfortunately it can't be wrapped up in a tidy, happy ending in which our heroic CEO realizes his temptations and suddenly becomes the world's most effective leader. Like so much of life, it's a messy, constant, and unavoidable process, but it's one that great leaders welcome.
A summary of why executives fail.
One of the most subtle but powerful challenges of being a CEO, or any leader for that matter, is the ability to avoid getting trapped by the daily complexities and details of our organizations. To rise above that challenge, we must learn to resist the temptations that Andrew and Charlie outlined in the story. Let's take a deeper look at those temptations now.
Temptation 1. Choosing status over results.
The most important principle that an executive must embrace is a desire to produce results. Now, as obvious as that sounds, it's not universally practiced by the highest-ranking executives in many companies. All too many CEOs put something ahead of results on their list of priorities, and it represents the single most dangerous of all the temptations, and that's the desire to protect the status of their careers. How can a person become the CEO of a company and not be a maniac for results, you might be wondering? Well, most CEOs were results maniacs before reaching their ultimate jobs. Once they arrive, though, many of them focus primarily on preserving their status. This occurs because their real purpose in life has always been personal gain, and with nowhere to go but down, it almost makes sense that once they have achieved their ultimate status, they'll do whatever they can to protect it. Now, this causes CEOs to make decisions that protect their ego or reputation, or worse yet, to avoid making decisions that might damage their ego. So they end up rewarding people who contribute to their reputation and ego, instead of those who contribute to the results of the company. This poses a good question. Don't executives realize that by focusing on results, they will ultimately achieve greater status and ego satisfaction in their careers? Yes, but this requires a lot of work over a long period of time, and that allows for too many risky episodes of status loss along the way. Remember, even temporary loss of status is unacceptable to CEOs who do not resist this temptation.
Simple advice for CEOs.
Make results the most important measure of personal success, or step down from your job. The future of the company you lead is just too important for customers and employees and stockholders to hold it hostage to your ego.
Temptation 2. Choosing popularity over accountability.
Even CEOs who resist the temptation to over-focus on protecting their status sometimes fail. Why? Because they don't hold their direct reports accountable for delivering on the commitments which drive results. This happens because they succumb to a second temptation, the desire to be popular. Wanting to be well-liked by peers is an understandable but dangerous problem for CEOs. Being at the top of an organization is lonely, and there are very few people in a company who CEOs spend considerable time with, aside from their direct reports. Those reports are often the same age and earn the same kind of money as the CEO, especially relative to other employees in the company. So most CEOs become friends with their reports and commiserate with them about the constant needs and shortfalls of employees. They develop a sense of camaraderie around the overwhelming responsibilities they face. It's no surprise, then, that when it comes time for a CEO to tell these people that they're not meeting expectations, they balk. Empirical evidence of this phenomenon is that CEOs conduct performance reviews for their direct reports far less diligently than managers at other levels. Why? Well, it isn't because they're too busy or too lazy. It's because they don't want to deal with the prospect of upsetting one of their peers. Ironically, those same CEOs will not hesitate to ultimately fire a direct report when his or her performance problem becomes too costly, thereby severing the relationship completely. But they often fail to provide constructive or negative feedback along the way.
Simple advice for CEOs.
Work for the long-term respect of your direct reports, not their affection. Don't view them as a support group, but as key employees who must deliver on their commitments if the company is to produce predictable results. And remember, your people aren't going to like you anyway if they ultimately fail.
Temptation 3. Choosing certainty over clarity.
Even CEOs who resist the temptation to protect their status and the temptation to be popular with their direct reports sometimes fail. Why? Because even if they're willing to hold their direct reports accountable, they're often reluctant to do so because they don't think it's fair. And that's because they haven't made it clear what their direct reports are accountable for doing in the first place. And why don't they make these things clear? Because they give in to yet another temptation, the need to make correct decisions to achieve certainty. Many CEOs, especially the highly analytical ones, want to ensure that their decisions are correct, which is impossible in a world of imperfect information and uncertainty. Still, executives with a need for precision and correctness often postpone decisions and fail to make their people's deliverables clear. They provide vague and hesitant direction to their direct reports and hope that they figure out the right answers along the way. The chances that they will produce the results if CEOs eventually decide they want are very slim.
Simple advice for CEOs.
Make clarity more important than accuracy. Remember that your people will learn more if you take decisive action than if you always wait for more information. And if the decisions you make in the spirit of creating clarity turn out to be wrong when more information does become available, change plans and explain why. It's your job to risk being wrong. The only real cost to you is a loss of pride. The cost of not taking that risk is paralysis in your company.
Temptation 4. Choosing harmony over productive conflict.
Even CEOs who resist the temptation to protect their status, and the temptation to be popular with their direct reports, and the temptation to make correct decisions, sometimes fail because they don't feel comfortable with the decisions they make. That's because they haven't benefited from the best source of information that is always available to them, and that's their direct reports. They do this because they give in to the next temptation, the desire for harmony. Most people, including CEOs, believe that it's better for people to agree and to get along than to disagree and have conflict with one another. That is how many of us are raised. However, harmony sometimes restricts what I call productive ideological conflict, the passionate interchange of opinions around an issue. Without this kind of conflict, decisions are often suboptimal. The best decisions are made only after all knowledge and all perspectives are out on the table. Every person's perspective and opinion will not be agreed with, of course, but they will be considered. And when all available knowledge is considered, the chances of optimal decisions are greater, not to mention the confidence in those decisions, which is just as important.
Simple advice for CEOs.
Tolerate discord. Encourage your direct reports to air their ideological differences and to do so with passion. Tumultuous meetings are often signs of progress. Tame ones are often signs of leaving important issues off the table.
Temptation 5. Choosing invulnerability over trust.
Even CEOs who resist the temptation to protect their status, to be popular with their direct reports, to make correct decisions, and to create harmony sometimes fail. Why? Because even though they are willing to cultivate productive conflict, their people may not be willing to do so. And why is that? It's because the CEO gives in to the final temptation. the desire for invulnerability. CEOs are relatively powerful people. Being vulnerable with their peers and reports is not a comfortable prospect for them. So they mistakenly believe that they will lose credibility if their people feel too comfortable challenging their ideas.
Simple advice for CEOs.
Actively encourage your people to challenge your ideas. Trust them with your reputation and with your ego. As a CEO, that's the greatest level of trust that you can give. They will return it with respect and honesty, and with a desire to be vulnerable among their peers.
The model.
The model for avoiding the 5 temptations works in reverse order of the temptations themselves. Let's take a look at that. It begins with choosing trust over vulnerability. Having trust gives executives the confidence to have productive ideological conflict. Having conflict gives executives the confidence to create clarity. Clarity then gives executives the confidence to hold people accountable. And accountability gives executives confidence in expected results. Of course, results are a CEO's ultimate measure of long-term success.
Self-assessment.
Ultimately, the best way to understand which of the 5 temptations is most tempting for you is to simply reflect on the model and decide which temptations seem to fit. A good way to do this is to ask yourself, which of the temptations made me feel most uncomfortable? While this is certainly unscientific, the best self-assessment is often an unstructured, qualitative one. However, some people do prefer to use a diagnostic tool to provide a little more structure in their search for the temptation that they have. And that is what I'd like to give you now. Some of the following questions are tricky because what they reveal will not seem like weaknesses at all. However, keep in mind that this tool is designed to measure your susceptibility to a given temptation, not to determine that you definitely succumb to it. Ultimately, that will have to be your call.
Facing Temptation 1. Choosing status over results. Do you personally consider it a professional failure when your organization fails to meet its objectives? Do you often wonder, what's next? What will I do to top this in my career? Would it bother you greatly if your company exceeded its objectives, but you remain somewhat anonymous relative to your peers in the industry?
On a professional level, organizational success and personal or professional success are one and the same. While it's healthy for any human being to separate his or her sense of self-esteem from success on the job, in the context of professional success, these should not be divided. Too often, CEOs justify their own individual performance, even while the organization they're leading is falling down around them. CEOs must ultimately judge their personal and professional success by the results of the bottom line. This is not to suggest that other human factors are not important, or even most important on a spiritual or emotional level. However, only the CEO is ultimately responsible for the results of the company, and this must be his or her ultimate measure. Additionally, a pronounced concern for the next step in a person's career is a good sign of susceptibility to temptation number 1, because it's a possible indication that success is being gauged in terms of career advancement rather than current performance. The most successful CEOs are focused almost exclusively on their current jobs. Finally, worrying about how much public recognition one receives is a possible sign of susceptibility to temptation number 1. While human nature dictates that we hope for a just share of acknowledgement in our lives, it's a dangerous part of human nature to entertain.
Facing Temptation 2. Choosing popularity over accountability. Do you consider yourself to be a close friend of your direct reports? Does it bother you to the point of distraction when they are unhappy with you? Do you often find yourself reluctant to give negative feedback to your direct reports, or watering down negative feedback to make it more palatable? Do you often vent to them about issues in the organization?
It's a wonderful thing for CEOs to care about direct reports as people, as long as they can separate the success of those relationships from their sense of self-esteem and personal happiness. This is difficult because most of us try to avoid major disagreements with close friends, and it's impossible not to be concerned about a deep rift with one of them. When those close friends are your direct reports, the accountability within the organization can be threatened. The slightest reluctance to hold someone accountable for their behaviors and results can cause an avalanche of negative reaction from others in the organization who perceive even the slightest hint of unfairness or favoritism.
Facing Temptation 3. Choosing certainty over clarity. Do you pride yourself on being intellectually precise? Do you prefer to wait for more information rather than making a decision without all of the facts? Do you enjoy debating details with your direct reports during meetings?
Certainly, intellectual precision alone is not a sign of temptation number 3. However, when it manifests itself during staff meetings in terms of unnecessary debates over minutia, it can be a real sign of trouble. It is no surprise that many CEOs take a great deal of pride in their analytical and intellectual acumen. They don't understand, however, that their success as executives has less to do with their intellectual skills than it does with personal discipline. And this can lead them to spend too much time debating the finer points of decision-making. If there is one person in an organization who cannot afford to be overly precise, it's the CEO.
Facing temptation 4. Choosing harmony over productive conflict. Do you like your meetings to be pleasant and enjoyable? Are meetings often boring? Do you get uncomfortable at meetings when your direct reports are arguing? Do you often make peace or try to reconcile direct reports who are at odds?
Productive executive staff meetings should be exhausting inasmuch as they are passionate, critical discussions. Pleasant meetings, or even worse, boring ones, are indications that there is not a proper level of overt, constructive, ideological conflict taking place. But don't be deceived. Every meeting has conflict. In some, executives sweep that conflict under the table and let employees deeper in the organization sort it out.
Facing temptation 5. Choosing invulnerability over trust. Do you have a hard time admitting when you're wrong? Do you fear that your direct reports want your job? Do you try to keep your greatest weaknesses secret from your direct reports?
No one loves admitting when they're wrong, but some people really hate it. Great CEOs don't feel the slightest bit of loss of face when they're wrong, because they know who they are, they know why they're the CEO, and they realize that the organization's results are their ultimate measure of success, not their appearance of being smart. They also know that the best way to get results is to put their weaknesses on the table and invite people to help them minimize those weaknesses. CEOs who understand this concept intellectually, but cannot behavioralize it, sometimes make the mistake of finding symbolic moments to admit mistakes and weaknesses. This only serves to reinforce the notion that that CEO is unwilling to put real weaknesses on the table. Overcoming this temptation requires a degree of fear and pain to make it real. If you have a difficult time identifying your temptations, you may want to ask your direct reports to answer these questions and then compare your responses to theirs. This is sure to provoke the kind of productive ideological conflict that we've been talking about, the kind of passionate discussion that will lead you toward effective leadership and away from the 5 temptations of a CEO.
The 5 Temptations of a CEO, a leadership fable, was written by Patric Lecioni and read by Boyd Gaines, with an introduction and afterword by the author. The mix engineer was Jocelyn Gonzalez. The recording engineer was Terry Hogan. Editing and post-production by Common Mode, Paul Fowley, Technical Director. The 5 Temptations of a CEO was produced and directed by Jan Werner. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio.